Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into the tangled roots of US-Panama relations, long before the tanks rolled in and the headlines screamed invasion. What if I told you that a canal, a handshake, and a covert alliance quietly laid the groundwork for one of the most controversial US military actions in Latin America? And what if the biggest secrets weren't hidden in bunkers, but in contracts, treaties, and the fine print of foreign aid? Let's set the stage. The Panama Canal. Just hearing those words evokes an image of massive ships slicing through a narrow corridor of land that redefined global trade. When it opened in 1914, it wasn't just a marvel of engineering. It became a cornerstone of American geopolitical strategy. This canal cut shipping time in half and, more importantly, gave the United States a military and economic chokehold over two oceans. The US didn't just build the canal, they guarded it like a crown jewel, projecting influence far beyond Panama's borders. Fast forward to 1977. Enter the Torrijos-Carter treaties. These weren't just pieces of paper, they were a diplomatic earthquake. For the first time, the US agreed to transfer control of the canal to Panama, gradually, over 2 decades. This was more than a legal arrangement. It was a symbolic moment, a signal to Latin America that maybe, just maybe, the era of US domination was softening. But don't be fooled. This treaty didn't erase decades of power imbalance overnight. It simply dressed it in diplomacy. Now, zoom in on the Cold War years. While the world watched the US and the Soviet Union spar across continents, Panama became a pawn on the chessboard. Enter Manuel Noriega, a man who understood power, paranoia, and the price of loyalty. He was a staunch anti-communist, and that made him useful. The US funneled money, training, and intelligence his way, not because he was democratic or transparent, but because he was reliable in the game of global containment. As long as he kept communists out of Panama, Washington looked the other way. And then there's the quiet part, the part whispered in classified rooms and buried in budget lines, aid and covert operations. Billions of dollars flowed into Panama, and not all of it came with strings attached, at least, not the kind visible to the public. Intelligence sharing, clandestine deals, and backdoor alliances masked what was really happening. Repression flourished, democracy withered, and the illusion of partnership began to crack. So, before the boots hit the ground in 1989, the story was already in motion. The seeds had been planted over decades, through treaties, power plays, and shadow diplomacy. Up next, we'll take a closer look at the man who sat at the center of this storm, Manuel Noriega. How did he go from US ally to public enemy number one? Now, let's talk about Manuel Noriega, a man who didn't just rise through Panama's military ranks, he climbed his way into the pages of US intelligence briefings, drug cartel reports, and, eventually, war plans. Noriega's path to power wasn't built through elections or popularity. It was built through uniforms, secrets, and connections. He rose within Panama's National Guard, an institution that functioned as both a military and a political force. And behind the scenes, the CIA was watching and helping. US intelligence saw Noriega as a valuable asset. He was anti-communist, he understood local dynamics, and he played the long game. With their backing, Noriega consolidated control, not just of the military, but of the country. But here's the twist. Noriega wasn't just a US partner. He was also deeply involved in the drug trade. At one point, he was literally on the CIA payroll while simultaneously trafficking narcotics with cartels. That's not speculation. That's on the record. So why would the US tolerate this? Well, welcome to the Cold War, where moral clarity often took a backseat to strategic necessity. As long as Noriega kept the Red Scare at bay, the US held its nose and cashed the checks. Meanwhile, inside Panama, things were unraveling. Noriega crushed opposition, censored the press, and, when elections didn't go his way, he simply annulled them. Political repression wasn't a side effect. It was policy. Dissent became dangerous. Democracy became a charade. And the people of Panama paid the price. But by the late 1980s, the winds began to shift. Noriega's usefulness was wearing thin. His drug ties were harder to ignore. His brutality harder to excuse. US media picked up the story. Politicians, once silent, began to speak, and the same government that had propped him up started talking about sanctions and moral outrage. Funny how fast values reappear when strategy no longer aligns. Noriega had become, in the eyes of Washington, a liability, not because he changed, but because the political math did. The same system that built him was now preparing to break him. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the US moved from backroom deals to battlefield orders, Operation Just Cause, and the full-scale invasion of Panama. By December 1989, diplomacy was out and military boots were in. The United States launched Operation Just Cause, an invasion of Panama that would shock the world and leave behind a trail of questions that still haven't been fully answered. So what was the official story? The US government presented a tightly packed list of justifications. They said the invasion was necessary to protect American lives. They framed it as a move to restore democracy after Noriega's fraudulent election annulments. They pointed to his involvement in drug trafficking. They raised concerns about the Panama Canal security, and they promised justice. Noriega would be arrested and brought to trial. But under those layers of rationale, there was another objective, one not always said out loud: regime change. Let's not sugarcoat it. This was a full-scale military operation aimed at removing a head of state. And while the language was humanitarian, phrases like defending democracy and protecting civilians, the action was forceful, swift, and overwhelming. And speaking of force, let's talk scale. Over 27,000 US troops flooded into Panama in a lightning-fast campaign designed to cripple Noriega's military power. The invasion was high-tech, high-impact, and high casualty. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. Civilian lives were lost. But those images? You wouldn't have seen many of them on your television screen. Why? Because the US government tightly controlled the media narrative. There was a deliberate blackout on certain coverage, and information flow was filtered through official briefings. Reporters had limited access. Civilian casualties were underreported. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a media strategy. The goal was to maintain public support and suppress any backlash before it could gain traction. So while Operation Just Cause was framed as a moral mission, the execution revealed a deeper reality, one where overwhelming force met controlled storytelling, and where justification served as a cloak for strategic priorities. In the next section, we're going to look at what happened when the world stepped back and asked a hard question: was this invasion even legal? So, was it legal? That's the question the global community immediately raised after the dust began to settle in Panama. And the answer, from many corners of the world, was a resounding no. The United Nations General Assembly didn't mince words. They called the US invasion a flagrant violation of international law. That's not diplomatic language. That's a formal condemnation. According to the UN, the operation lacked legitimate justification under the framework of sovereignty that governs international relations. In simpler terms, Panama was not a threat to the United States. So why the tanks? And that leads us to the heart of the ethical dilemma: bypassing global norms. Operation Just Cause set a dangerous precedent. It said that a superpower could, unilaterally, decide when and where to use force, even if it meant ignoring multilateral processes. It undermined the very institutions built after World War II to prevent this kind of thing from happening. What happens to global stability when the rules are optional for the powerful? Then come the consequences: real, tangible, and devastating. Civilian casualties weren't just a statistic. They were mothers, children, shopkeepers, caught in the crossfire of a conflict they didn't choose. Infrastructure crumbled. Neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The political vacuum left behind fueled long-term instability and mistrust, not just in Panama, but across Latin America. People began asking, if this could happen to Panama, who's next? And finally, we have to zoom out and recognize the pattern. This wasn't the first time the US intervened in another country under the banner of restoring order, and it wouldn't be the last. From Guatemala to Iran to Chile, the historical pattern is striking. When strategic interests are on the line, sovereignty often takes a backseat. The Panama invasion fits squarely into that narrative, a case study in how foreign policy can shift from partnership to intervention when control is at stake. Coming up, we'll explore the aftermath. Noriega was gone, but what replaced him? Was it liberation, or something else entirely? After the smoke cleared and Noriega was behind bars, the question wasn't just what happened, it became what now. The United States installed Guillermo Indara as Panama's new president, quite literally. He was sworn in on a US military base during the invasion. That's not exactly a symbol of democratic independence. To many Panamanians, it looked less like a free election and more like a changing of the guard, American approved and American arranged. Then came the economic reforms. But here's the twist: these reforms weren't designed by Panamanians for Panamanians. They were crafted in Washington and shaped by institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Privatization, deregulation, structural adjustments, all presented as the cure for Panama's economy. But who really benefited? Foreign investors? International corporations? Or the everyday Panamanian trying to rebuild their life? This is where the term neocolonialism enters the picture. You see, neocolonialism isn't about occupying land with soldiers anymore. It's about occupying policy with contracts, debt, and economic dependency. In the post-invasion landscape, Panama's sovereignty was technically intact, but but practically constrained. It had to play by the rules of those who held the purse strings. And resistance? It didn't go away. Protests erupted. Critics called out the hypocrisy of using democracy as a slogan while ignoring local voices. Many Panamanians didn't feel liberated. They felt managed, overseen by foreign forces who claimed to know what was best. So was this nation building? Or was it a rebranding of control under the guise of progress? That question still lingers. And in the next section, we'll take a wider lens, because Panama wasn't just a one-time anomaly. It became a model, a playbook, and that playbook, it got used again. When historians look back on the Panama invasion, they don't just see an isolated event. They see a blueprint, a trial run for a doctrine that would shape global politics for decades to come: regime change, American style. Panama showed just how quickly the United States could dismantle a foreign government, install a new one, and justify the entire operation in the language of freedom, democracy, and human rights. But behind that language was a strategy, and that strategy would echo loudly in the years to follow. Take a step forward to Iraq. Sound familiar? A vilified leader, a list of justifications, some credible, some shaky, a rapid, overwhelming military strike, promises of democracy, media management, civilian casualties, long-term instability. It's as if the same pages were lifted from the Panama playbook and photocopied for Baghdad. Even the tactics on the ground had their origins here. Urban warfare wasn't a sidebar, it was the main event. Fighting took place not in jungles or deserts, but in city streets, apartment complexes, and densely populated neighborhoods. The military had to adapt, fast, and that adaptation, it became standard practice in later conflicts. The consequences weren't just tactical, they were philosophical. Panama introduced a new normal: if a nation could be deemed unstable, corrupt, or threatening to U.S. interests, even vaguely, it could be targeted for intervention. And if it resisted, all the better for building a narrative. But here's the dangerous part. This kind of doctrine doesn't come with built-in limits. Once the precedent is set, the threshold for action lowers. The definition of a threat becomes more flexible, and the global order begins to tilt, not toward shared law, but toward unilateral force. Panama, in that sense, wasn't just about Noriega. It was about crafting a model, a proof of concept, one that allowed future interventions to be framed not as power grabs, but as noble missions. So the next time you hear about restoring democracy through military means, remember this: we've seen the script before. And that brings us to our final reflection, a look at what this strategy costs in the long run, not just in dollars or lives, but in moral clarity and global trust. So here we are, at the end of the campaign, the end of the mission, but not the end of the story. The U.S. invasion of Panama wasn't just a historical event. It was a moral test, a test of how far a nation will go in the name of security, how many lines it's willing to blur for the sake of stability, and how easily power can be justified when dressed in patriotic language. At the heart of it all is a recurring theme: the moral hazard. When a country with immense military strength begins to view force as a first response instead of a last resort, it creates a feedback loop, one where each use of power feels more normal, more defensible, more routine. And each time that happens, the bar for intervention gets just a little bit lower. We saw this in Panama. We saw it again in Iraq. We see it today in conflicts that barely make the front page. And each time, the logic is similar. We're helping, we're liberating, we're restoring order. But what if we're also destabilizing? What if we're planting seeds of resentment that grow into deeper conflict down the line? And what if we've convinced ourselves that intentions are enough? That's the hazard, not just the bombs or the boots, but the belief that we are always the good guys, even when the outcomes tell a more complicated story. There's an alternative path, though, one that values voluntary cooperation over coercion, one that recognizes the limits of centralized control, one that asks hard questions before reaching for hard power. Because history doesn't just remember what we do, it remembers how we justify it. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this journey through the tangled politics of power and intervention, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We post thoughtful, entertaining videos that dive deep into the past to help make sense of the present. And if you want to hear more on the go, check out the podcast version of this episode. Links in the description. We'll see you in the next one.